you know, we got a lot of blank stares when we mentioned the title of our symposium. It's very mysterious, indexical design. What does it mean? And to some extent, this was deliberate since, especially in the information design discourse, there are many buzzwords and there are many kind of topics that are very, you know, big, wicked problems that are discussed in many different forms. So we tried to approach familiar questions that we all struggle with from a different direction. So the term indexical design came out from several years ago from a collaboration with Orkan Telhan, who is also going to speak here today, and myself, and is of course a reference to semiotics of Charles Sanders Peirce. And this is how I usually explain the three kinds of signs to students. Oh, we have two. Can we switch? So, Peirce mentioned three different ways in which a sign can speak to us: as a symbol, as an icon, and as an index. So we see, you know, the middle lane is a kind of a symbolic sign. It's basically an arbitrary choice to use red, to use yellow to separate the lanes. Iconic is a resemblance of what happens if you drive too fast. And the indexical sign is basically the trace of what happened if you, in fact, go too fast. So Peirce characterized the index as a sign that has a causal relationship to a thing in the world. There's like smoke indicates fire. It's a little bit more complicated because he also changed and evolved his thinking about the index over time. But with respect to information design, we can see that actually information design and visualization deals to a large part with symbolic forms of representation, charts, graphs, and so on. We also have iconic forms of representations, diagrams, explosion, isometric, medical illustrations, and things like that. But we have very little to work with respect to indexical signs. So one could say that, well, maybe this is okay. Maybe this is what information visualization is all about. It's all about a little bit like this, you know, basically rearranging data, having like symbolic operations, transforming data, mapping data, and rearranging it in a legible format. Maybe indexicality is not relevant. In this symposium, we make this argument why we think this is not the case. And I think there are several reasons, three reasons that I will briefly talk about. The first is that there is a certain kinship between indexical phenomena and the languages of information visualization. And that starts with the German word of reading. Lesen actually has a dual meaning. On the one hand, it means reading text, but it also means picking up things from the ground. So the way we read text and the way we read traces is related. And we see this when we consider, you know, for example, tree rings. You know, we can read them in many ways, like data visualizations. There are visual variables like color, area, shape, distance. And of course, you know, we can play this game in multiple ways, bar charts. It gets interesting when we come to the seismograph, because it is originally a mechanical device that creates an indexical trace, but which is at the same time a line diagram. So we have basically this dual way, or this dual mode. And at this point we see that symbols, icons, and indices are not exclusive categories, and we sometimes read them in the same way. And we can even take this to the extreme and think about indexical relationships precisely only within the digital domain. This is a visualization based on the WikiLeaks data of the Iraq casualties. And what the designer did here is basically pick one pixel for every person that died. And so as a result, there's this one-to-one relationship, and this representation also has a fixed size. You cannot scale it and transform it, what you would usually do with digital representations without breaking this relationship. So there are many indexical strategies that we can use in information design. Another thing is that we associate traces with evidence, and visual evidence is a very important thing in visualization. So we always try to make the case for evidence. And yeah, there's obvious link to the forensic sciences, the detective who studies traces, how things in the space are related to each other in order to infer causality of what happened in this particular space. And the trust and mistrust in forensic methods, latent fingerprints, DNA profiles, and so on, is a constant theme that will also be discussed in the second panel today. But establishing physical evidence is also especially important in realms like citizen science, where environmental activists who operate outside of the scientific orthodoxy are hard-pressed to provide convincing evidence that would basically, support their arguments and their experience of pollution and other cases of concern. But what we often forget is that traces are not simply there in nature, waiting to be discovered. They are the result of our measurement. Which means that traces, they might be objective in the literal sense, but they're not necessarily neutral. So here we see Francis Galton's attempts to abstract the features from fingerprints, even as we have known for a long time that fingerprints are something unique. It's still a very complicated procedure to make it operational, and the question of to what extent this really then becomes evidence is a very problematic question, and we're also going to talk about this in the second panel. And even in the most simple case, in order to see tree rings, we first have to cut a tree. The last point, traces, they do not explain, they show something. And now again, even if we're in a purely symbolic realm, we find certain indexical mechanisms. For example, consider your internet router at home. It has these blinking LED lights. They all have a very precisely defined symbolic meaning. I'm sure very few of us actually know or care about those. But if suddenly the router in the middle of the night starts blinking like crazy, we might wonder what's going on, whether someone's trying to break into our computer or whether our computer is downloading the latest Windows update. But in a sense, we read those blinking lights like we read traces, like cues that give us a sense of activity. Disciplines such as biology, which are now all about information, also encounter questions of scale. So most of this information cannot be directly experienced, and when we look at microbiome projects that link what happens on the microbial scale with things that happen at a much larger urban scale, we have to think about also ways of how to basically communicate these connections. So where is design in this picture? So maybe one way to think about it is that traces are constructed, but they are constructed in different ways compared to symbolic representations. So revealing traces is mostly about framing a phenomenon, not mapping it or transforming it. So some examples, for example, this is a student project from my students back in Austria 10 years ago that showed the impact of air quality in different cities directly through its effect on different lettuce plants. This was installed at Ars Electronica 2007. And this is a recent project from students here at Northeastern, where we did a sound mapping project with sound artists Sam Auinger and Bruce Odland. And this particular project investigated the different noise floors in different areas of the campus and the subway system. And instead of recording the spectrograms of the sound profile, these students made a toolkit of different objects. So there was a coin, there was a key, there was an empty water bottle, there was a book, and there were flip-flops, and you would simply drop those in different places of campus, and in that way experience. Do you still hear it, or don't you hear it because it's too noisy around? Does it sound different in different places? Is the room and the space changing what you hear? Let me see, maybe we hear some things. Yeah, okay, we should hear something, but you can imagine. So, for the sake of time. So, I just wanted to conclude with a set of questions that are from a not exactly recent anthology edited by German media theorist and philosopher Sibylle Krämer and others. Unfortunately, the book has not been yet translated to English, so I basically took it upon myself, please excuse me, for butchering this up, but it asks exactly those questions that I think are very interesting for our day, for this discussion today. Is reading traces an ancient relic of wild knowledge, or is it present in all developed symbolic, epistemic, and interpretative practices? How can we differentiate reading traces from reading text and from interpreting linguistic and visual signs? Are traces the seam where the meaningless becomes meaningful? Do they connect our representational practices with the tangibility, physicality, and materiality of the world? Are traces discovered, or are they constructed in the act of reading? So if you look at your program, which is also a indexical visualization of sorts, it's a kind of a reference to an old device, the cyanometer, that was used by Alexander von Humboldt in South America to measure the blueness of the sky in order to estimate the humidity of the air in order to map the different climate zones. So you hold it up and compare the color of the sky with the scale, which was developed by Pedro Cruz and Tom Starr, faculty here at Northeastern, did a great job. Just a few more people who made this event possible. I wanted to thank Center for the Arts, Bree Edwards, Tom Van Adder, Terry Evans, Daniel Lim, all students who have helped and are still helping to get this event off the ground. Sorry. And Northeastern staff, Judy Ullman, Alison Kelly, Mark Aylward, Chris Franzen, Nathan Feldy, chair of our art and design faculty, Doug Scott, Anne McDonald, John Kane, Mary Sherman, Goethe Institute and Swissnex, of course, and all the speakers who have joined us today, and of course you, the audience, who chose to spend this beautiful day with us. Thank you very much.